Following the collapse of Roman authority in Gaul, local leaders and incoming peoples began shaping the political landscape that would eventually form the Kingdom of France. But to understand what emerged, we must first understand what was there before. At its height, Roman Gaul, known officially as Gallia, was one of the empire's most administratively developed and economically productive provinces. Stretching from the Rhine in the northeast to the Pyrenees in the southwest, Gaul was integrated into the Roman system through roads, taxation, urban centers, and military infrastructure. Cities such as Lugdunum, modern Lyon, Burdigala, Bordeaux, and Lutetia, Paris, functioned as hubs of commerce, governance, and Latin culture. Archaeological evidence reveals a province that had undergone centuries of Romanization. Latin displaced many local dialects among urban elites. Roman architectural forms, basilicas, amphitheaters, forums, aqueducts, appeared across Gallic cities. However, as scholars including Guy Halsall, Barbarian Migrations and the Roman West, Cambridge University Press, 2007, have noted, this Romanization was uneven. Rural communities often preserved older practices, local religious traditions, and distinct settlement patterns even as Roman administrative systems spread around them. By the late 4th century, cracks in Roman control had begun to appear. Military pressures on the Rhine frontier intensified as various groups, Germanic, Hunnic, and others, pressed westward into Roman territory. The Roman state responded by recruiting large numbers of non-Roman soldiers and settling federate groups, peoples who agreed to military service in exchange for land and some degree of self-governance within provincial boundaries. This was not an unusual policy, it had precedent, but the scale was increasing, and the capacity of the central imperial administration to maintain coherent control over its western regions was diminishing. Historians debate the precise nature and pace of this decline. Some, following the traditional narrative associated with Edward Gibbon, emphasize internal decay and military overextension. Others, such as Brian Ward Perkins, The Fall of Rome and the End of Civilization, Oxford University Press, 2005, point to the material evidence, a measurable decline in pottery quality, building construction, and long-distance trade as signs of genuine systemic collapse. Still others, including Peter Heather, The Fall of the Roman Empire, Macmillan, 2006, focus on the role of external pressures from migrating peoples. The debate remains active in academic circles. What is broadly agreed upon is this. By the early 5th century, the Roman imperial administration's effective control over Gaul was fragmenting. Power was shifting to local Roman aristocrats, to military commanders, to bishops, and to the leaders of federate and migrating groups now settled within the province. The stage was being set for a transformation that would unfold over the next several centuries. If you find this history as fascinating as we do, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, subscribing for more documentary content, and sharing it with anyone who loves history. It genuinely helps us keep making content like this. The year 476 CE is often cited in popular history as the fall of Rome, the moment when the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus. However, historians are careful to note that this date, while symbolically significant, did not represent an overnight transformation. The process of imperial dissolution in the West was gradual, contested, and deeply uneven across different regions. In Gaul specifically, the 5th century was characterized by what scholars describe as a period of overlapping authority. Roman administrative structures did not vanish immediately. Roman aristocrats continued to hold land and local influence. Roman law remained a reference point. Latin continued as the language of administration and the church. Yet, alongside these continuities, new political actors were asserting territorial control. Several groups established themselves within Gaul during this period.
The Visigoths, who had entered Roman service as federates, eventually established a kingdom centered in Toulouse in the southwest by the early 5th century. The Burgundians settled in the Rhone Valley. The Bretons, closely tied to connections with Roman Britain, occupied the Armorican Peninsula in the northwest, the region we know today as Brittany. In the far north and northeast, various Frankish groups had long maintained a presence along the Rhine frontier and began expanding their influence southward and westward. It is important, as scholars such as Walter Goffard, Barbarians and Romans, Princeton University Press, 1980, have emphasized, to resist the older narrative of violent barbarian invasion replacing a functioning Roman civilization. The picture that emerges from archaeological and documentary evidence is more complex, a negotiated process of settlement, intermarriage, administrative accommodation, and cultural blending, alongside genuine violence and disruption in certain regions and periods. Archaeological evidence from burial sites is particularly instructive. Cemeteries in northern Gaul from the 5th and 6th centuries show a mixture of material culture, Roman-style grave goods alongside items associated with Frankish or Germanic traditions, suggesting communities in transition rather than populations cleanly divided by ethnic lines. The work of archaeologists including Patrick Perrin and his colleagues at the Musée d'Archéologie Nationale in Saint-Germain-en-Laye has been significant in mapping these transitional burial horizons. Among the groups present in Gaul, it was the Franks who would prove most consequential for the long-term political development of the region. Initially a confederation of smaller groups rather than a single unified people, the Franks gradually coalesced under strong military leadership in the late 5th century. Their geographic position in the north gave them access to both former Roman administrative infrastructure and the Rhine frontier zone. The emergence of Frankish dominance over Gaul was not predetermined. It resulted from military success, political maneuvering, and the ability of Frankish leaders to present themselves, credibly or otherwise, as inheritors and continuers of Roman authority. The figure most associated with this transformation is Clovis, the Merovingian king whose reign reshaped the political map of Gaul in the late 5th and early 6th centuries.
The Merovingian dynasty takes its name from Merovech, a semi-legendary figure whom later Frankish tradition identified as a founding ancestor of the royal line. Historians treat this genealogical claim with caution, as the sources for the earliest Merovingians are limited and often written generations after the events they describe. What is better documented is the reign of Clovis I, who ruled from approximately 481 to 511 CE, and whose career is described in some detail by Gregory of Tours in his Histories, composed in the late 6th century. Gregory of Tours is our most significant narrative source for early Merovingian history, and scholars work carefully with his account, recognizing that it was written with specific religious and political purposes in mind. Gregory presents Clovis as a Christian king whose military victories were divinely sanctioned, a framing that reflects the perspective of the Frankish Church of Gregory's own era rather than a neutral historical record. Nevertheless, the broad outline of Clovis's political career, the unification of Frankish groups under his leadership, military campaigns against the Visigoths, Burgundians, and other regional powers, and his conversion to Catholic Christianity, is corroborated by other sources and archaeological evidence. Clovis's conversion to Catholic Christianity, traditionally dated to around 496 or 498 CE, the exact date is debated, was politically consequential. Unlike the Visigoths and Burgundians, who had adopted Arian Christianity, a theological position condemned as heretical by the Roman Church, Clovis aligned himself with the Catholic orthodoxy supported by the Bishop of Rome and the majority of the Gallo-Roman population. This alignment gave Clovis and the Frankish kingdom the support of the Gallic ecclesiastical establishment and facilitated cooperation between the Frankish royal administration and the powerful network of Roman tradition bishops across Gaul. The baptism of Clovis, likely performed by Bishop Remigius Rheims, became a foundational narrative in later French royal ideology,
though historians caution against reading later medieval or modern nationalist meanings back into a 5th century event. For Clovis himself, conversion was almost certainly intertwined with political calculation, as well as, possibly, personal religious conviction. The sources do not allow confident access to his interior motivations. By the time of Clovis's death in 511 CE, the Merovingian Franks controlled a territory stretching across much of former Roman Gaul. However, Frankish political culture did not replicate the centralized Roman imperial model. Kingship was personal and patrimonial. The kingdom was understood as property to be divided among male heirs. This practice of partition led to the fragmentation of Frankish power across the 6th and 7th centuries into sub-kingdoms, Neustria, Austrasia, and Burgundy, whose aristocracies frequently clashed. The Merovingian dynasty persisted until the mid-8th century, though by its final decades, real power had passed to the office of the mayor domus, or mayor of the palace, a position that would give rise to the next great dynasty in Frankish history.
Understanding how the early Frankish kingdom actually functioned, as distinct from its idealized representations in later sources, requires looking beyond royal courts to the structures of local authority that made governance possible in a fragmented, predominantly rural society. The Merovingian kingdom did not have a permanent capital or a professional centralized bureaucracy in the Roman tradition. Administration was conducted through royal itineration. The king and his court moved continuously, consuming the resources of royal estates across the kingdom while dispensing justice and reinforcing personal bonds of loyalty. Royal authority was expressed primarily through personal relationships, oaths of loyalty, grants of land, and the distribution of gifts and offices. The county system, the division of territory into administrative units governed by counts, comites, appointed by the king, provided a framework for local governance, taxation, and military levy. However, as scholars, including Ian Wood, The Merovingian Kingdoms, Longman, 1994, have noted, the effectiveness of this system varied enormously by region and period. In areas where strong Gallo-Roman aristocratic families maintained their estates and influence, continuity with late Roman administrative practices was often substantial. In frontier zones, governance was more dependent on military power and personal dominance. The Church played an indispensable role in the functioning of Merovingian governance. Bishops in Gallic cities were often drawn from the same Gallo-Roman aristocratic families who had dominated local life in the late imperial period. They commanded ecclesiastical estates, administered charity and poor relief, maintained written administrative culture, and often served as the primary literate administrators available to Frankish kings who could not always read Latin themselves. The relationship between the Frankish monarchy and the Gallic episcopate was one of mutual dependency. Kings needed the Church's legitimating authority and administrative capacity. The Church needed royal protection and patronage. Legal culture in the Merovingian period was pluralistic. The Franks operated under a law code known as the Lex Salica, compiled in the early 6th century under Clovis. Gallo-Romans continued to be governed by Roman legal principles, at least formally. Burgundians had their own code, Visigoths theirs. This legal pluralism, in which different peoples living in the same territory were theoretically governed by the law of their own group, is a distinctive feature of post-Roman Germanic kingdoms that has attracted considerable scholarly attention. In practice, as Patrick Wormald and others have argued, the effectiveness of these distinctions was inconsistent and fluid. Archaeological evidence from this period illustrates the material realities of a society in transition. Excavations of Merovingian-era settlements in northern France, including sites associated with farmsteads, small churches, and burial grounds, reveal communities that used a mixture of continuing Roman craft traditions and new locally produced material culture. Long-distance trade continued but at reduced volumes compared to the Roman imperial peak. The monetized economy of the Roman period contracted, with land and agricultural produce becoming increasingly central to wealth and power. By the early 8th century, the Merovingian kings had become largely ceremonial figures. Real power had consolidated in the hands of the mayor bomus, the mayor of the palace, a position that had evolved from a household administrative role into the de facto leadership of the Frankish kingdom. The family that would come to be known as the Carolingians had dominated this office across Austrasia for several generations. The pivotal figure in the Carolingian ascent was Charles Martel, who served as mayor of the palace from approximately 718 until his death in 741. Charles consolidated Frankish power militarily, defeating a Muslim raiding force at the Battle of Tours-Poitiers in 732, an engagement that later medieval tradition elevated into a civilization-defining moment, though modern historians approach such framing with caution and note that the strategic significance of the battle was recognized more clearly in retrospect than at the time. Charles also reorganized the Frankish military, expanded Frankish territory into previously independent regions, and dispensed church lands to build a loyal fighting force, a practice that generated friction with the ecclesiastical establishment. His son, Pippin III, took the final step that the Carolingians had long approached but not completed, the replacement of the Merovingian dynasty. In 751, with the approval of Pope Zachary, whose endorsement was sought and received by Frankish ambassadors, Pippin deposed the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, who was reportedly sent to a monastery. Pippin was anointed king by the Frankish clergy and subsequently received papal anointing in 754 from Pope Stephen II, who traveled to Francia in person, an unprecedented action that signaled the importance of the Frankish alliance to the papacy. This relationship between the Carolingian monarchy and the papacy would shape European political history for centuries. It was Pippin's son, Charles, known to later history as Charlemagne or Charles the Great, who transformed the Frankish kingdom into what became the Carolingian Empire. His reign from 768 to 814 saw the military expansion of Frankish power into Saxony, Bavaria, northern Spain, and Italy. In 800, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, an act of enormous symbolic significance whose precise political meaning has been debated by historians ever since. Did Charlemagne seek the title? Was he surprised by it, as his biographer Einhard claimed? What did it mean to revive the Roman imperial title in the West? These questions remain subjects of active scholarly discussion. What is broadly agreed upon is that the Carolingian imperial project represented a deliberate attempt to fuse Roman imperial tradition, Catholic Christianity, and Frankish kingship into a coherent political and cultural program. This project would have lasting consequences for the subsequent political organization of Western Europe.
No account of how Gaul became France can overlook the transformative role of Christianity and the institutional church in reshaping the region's cultural, intellectual, and social life between the 5th and 9th centuries. The church was not merely a spiritual institution. It was a major landowner and administrative network, a center of literacy and learning, and a force for both continuity and change. The Christianization of Gaul had begun well before the fall of the Western Roman Empire. By the 4th century, Christianity was the official religion of the Roman state, and Gallic cities had established bishoprics, cathedral communities, and a growing Christian material culture. Martyrs' shrines, basilicas built over their tombs, and pilgrimage networks linked Gallic communities to a broader Mediterranean Christian world. The cult of Saint Martin of Tours, a 4th-century bishop whose reputation for sanctity spread widely, illustrates how local religious life could generate significant regional influence. Gregory of Tours wrote extensively about Martin, and his tomb at Tours became one of the most important pilgrimage destinations in early medieval Western Europe. Monasticism, the practice of communal religious life under a rule or regula, expanded significantly in Gaul and then Francia from the 6th century onward. Monastic houses became major centers of agricultural production, manuscript copying, education, and artistic production. Irish peregrini, traveling monks from Ireland, including figures such as Columbanus, established influential monasteries in eastern Gaul and northern Italy from the late 6th century, introducing Irish monastic practices that interacted and sometimes clashed with existing Gallic traditions. By the Carolingian period, the rule of Saint Benedict, composed in Italy in the 6th century, was actively promoted as a standardizing framework for monastic life across the Frankish kingdom, a policy associated particularly with Charlemagne and his ecclesiastical advisors. The Carolingian Renaissance, a term used by historians to describe the cultural and intellectual program promoted by Charlemagne's court, involved the copying and preservation of classical Latin texts, the reform of script. Carolingian minuscule, a legible handwriting form developed at this time, is directly ancestral to the typefaces we use today. The establishment of palace and cathedral schools, and the production of richly decorated manuscript books. Scholars such as Rosamund McKitterick, The Carolingians and the Written Word, Cambridge University Press, 1989, have examined how this program of written culture reshaped the administrative and religious life of the Frankish kingdom. It is worth noting that the Carolingian cultural program was not simply a revival of Roman classical learning for its own sake. It was deliberately directed toward practical religious and administrative ends, the training of clergy who could correctly perform the liturgy, the production of accurate scriptural texts, and the education of administrators who could conduct the business of a complex kingdom. The cultural and the political were inseparable in the Carolingian project.
The process by which the Frankish kingdom of the Carolingian era gave rise to what we might recognize as the precursor to modern France was neither linear nor inevitable. It unfolded through political fragmentation, external pressure, and the gradual crystallization of regional identities over the 9th and 10th centuries. The death of Charlemagne in 814 was followed by the reign of his son Louis the Pious, and then in 843 by the Treaty of Verdun, one of the most consequential political agreements in early medieval European history. Facing civil conflict among Charlemagne's grandsons, the Carolingian heirs agreed to divide the empire into 3 portions. The western portion, Francia Occidentalis, was assigned to Charles the Bald. This western Frankish kingdom forms the most direct political precursor to what would become France, though the correspondence between its territory and later France is approximate rather than exact. The 9th century brought intense external pressures that further transformed the political landscape. Viking raids along the Atlantic and river coasts devastated monastic communities, disrupted trade networks, and forced local populations to seek protection from whoever could provide it, often local lords rather than distant kings. Magyar incursions from the east pressured the eastern and central regions. Muslim raids from the south affected coastal communities in the Mediterranean region. These pressures accelerated the fragmentation of centralized authority and the rise of local lordship that historians associate with the emergence of feudal political structures. Scholars debate the nature and timing of this feudal transformation. Georges Duby, Dominique Barthélemy, and others have engaged in substantial historiographical argument over when and how relationships of lord and vassal solidified into the structures associated with high medieval feudalism, and indeed whether feudalism is a useful analytical category at all. What is broadly agreed upon is that the 9th and 10th centuries saw a significant devolution of political and military power toward regional lords, counts, and castellans who exercised authority over increasingly localized territories. The Carolingian dynasty in the West gave way in 987 to the election of Hugh Capet as king of the Franks, an event that is conventionally marked as the beginning of the Capetian dynasty, and in retrospect a significant step in the long formation of the French monarchy. However, historians caution against reading this moment as a clean break or as the conscious foundation of France.
Hugh Capet's actual power was limited to a relatively small core territory around Paris and Orleans. The great territorial lords of the kingdom, the Dukes of Normandy, Burgundy, Aquitaine, and others, were largely autonomous. The entity we recognize as France, with centralized royal authority, defined territorial boundaries, and a consolidated administrative system, did not exist in the 9th or 10th century. It was the product of centuries of further struggle, negotiation, and state-building. But the foundations, the Frankish political tradition, the Catholic ecclesiastical network, the remnants of Roman administrative culture, and the emerging vernacular languages derived from Vulgar Latin were laid in the period we have examined in this documentary. From the fragmented province of late Roman Gaul, through the turbulent migrations and kingdoms of the early medieval centuries, through the Carolingian imperial experiment and its dissolution, the long and complex process of Francia's formation had begun. What emerged was not Rome restored, nor a simple continuation of Frankish tribal society, but something new. A medieval world shaped by the interaction of all these forces, whose consequences we can still trace in the political geography, languages, and institutions of modern France.